Hello and welcome. We are continuing to read Ranger in Time, Night of Soldiers and Spies. This is Chapter 3, Last Chance to Cross. Chapter 3 Vocabulary. Number 1, trousers. An outer garment covering the body from the waist to the ankles with a separate part for each leg. Number 2, enslaved. Made someone a slave. Number 3, merchant. A person involved in wholesale trade, especially one dealing with foreign countries or supplying merchandise to a particular trade. Number 4, trembled. Of a person or part of the body, shook involuntarily, typically because of anxiety, excitement, or frailty. Number 5, mariner. A sailor. Number 6, bowline knot. A simple knot for forming a non-slipping loop at the end of a rope. And you can see an example of how a bowline knot is actually tied in the illustration below. Number 7, redcoats. Nickname for regular British troops based on their uniforms having bright red coats, also called lobsterbacks. Number 8, hail. A large number of objects, such as musket balls, hurled forcefully through the air. Number 9, officer. A person holding a position of command or authority in the armed services. Number 10, hurl. Push or impel someone or oneself violently. Number 11, clenched. Of the fingers or hand, closed into a tight ball. And number 12, frantic. Conducted in a hurried, excited, and chaotic way, typically because of the need to act quickly. Now is a good time to take out your book and follow along. And again, this is Chapter 3, Last Chance to Cross. Ranger paddled through the mud to the edge of the river where a boy a little older than Luke was holding a boat. One by one, a line of tired-looking men climbed in. The boy's trousers were torn. His coat was streaked with mud. He smelled of smoke, river water, and sweat. "Sun's starting to rise," Isaac whispered to his friend Joe. Isaac knew Joe from the church back home in Marblehead. Joe was enslaved by a merchant who'd sent him to fight instead of joining the army himself. Joe nodded. "Don't quit on me now," he whispered. "You put in longer days than this in the Grand Banks, my friend. How many cod tongues did you say you turned in that day? 200? Isaac smiled, even though he trembled with chills. 220, he still remembered, pulling in fish after fish on his hand line that day. The fishermen cut out the tongue of each cod before salting it and tossing it into the hold. At the end of the day, they'd bring all the tongues to an officer to claim credit for their catch. That evening, Isaac had more than anyone. He had told Joel about his amazing catch when he returned from sea, but somehow it was a better story when Joe told it later that night at the blacksmith's shop. When Joe told the story, all the men put down their drinks to listen. Even if they'd been there, they wanted to hear him tell it. Isaac looked up the bank, where more men were streaming toward them in the dark. What a story Joel would have to tell of this night. But before the men arrived, a shaggy golden dog crept up to the boat. "What's this?" Joe asked. "One of the general's dogs?" "Probably." Isaac patted Ranger's head. "You'll have to wait to cross the river, dog. We have more men to move." "We better hope this fog doesn't lift," Joe said. "It's the only thing hiding our rear guard from the king's troops." Isaac shivered. He didn't know if it was because of the damp air, his fever, or his fear. He reached into his pocket and squeezed his good luck charm. It was just a short length of knotted rope, but its rough, scratchy feel always reminded him of home. Isaac's father had been a mariner, too. When Isaac was a small boy, his father had given him the rope to practice the knots he'd need to know to join the fleet one day. Isaac had just perfected his bowline knot the summer his father was lost at sea. Isaac never got to show him, and he never untied it. He kept the rope in his pocket, a way of keeping his father's memory close. It had gone with Isaac on his first fishing voyage to the Grand Banks. It had gone with him to enlist in Washington's army, and it would cross the river with him tonight. Back and forth Isaac rowed. Each time he crossed to Long Island, he held his breath. Would the redcoats be hiding in the fog, to greet them with a hail of gunfire. Ranger waited on shore for Isaac to take him wherever they were going, but one after another the boats left without him. Finally, Isaac's boat returned. One more trip should do it, Joe whispered as Isaac climbed out of the boat to help the last group of men on board. Isaac was holding it steady, but leaning against it too, as if he needed it to keep himself up. "You all right?" Joe asked him. "Yes," Isaac said, "just tired." Ranger sloshed over and licked Isaac's hand. Sometimes he did that with Luke when Luke was very tired or sick. It made him feel better to know that Ranger was there. "You can come this time, dog," Isaac whispered. After the last man boarded, Isaac thumped his hand on the side of the boat, and Ranger jumped in. "What's this?" an officer said, lifting the first aid kit from Ranger's neck. He opened it, took one look at the bandages inside, and let out a quiet huff of a laugh. "You suppose this will save us if the redcoats catch up?" he whispered. 5 bandages and a hail of popping sounds interrupted him. The officer stared toward shore, his eyes wide. Then he turned back to Isaac. "We must go." Isaac's entire body hurt, but what he saw when he looked up made him hurl himself into the boat. The redcoats were pouring down the hill toward the river. Isaac scrambled to his feet and started rowing. Isaac felt as if someone had a fist clenched around his heart. There was no way their little boats could outrun a British cannonball. He rowed as hard as he could. Each breath burned in his chest. Keep rowing, he thought. Isaac felt the dog at his side. Somehow it helped calm his racing heart, even as the gunfire grew louder. Ranger wanted to hide under a bench, but he stayed close to Isaac, even though the noise hurt his ears. It sounded like fireworks, but louder and with a sharp, dangerous smell. "All right now," the officer called when they were out of range of the British guns. The men rowing could finally slow their frantic pace. When the boat brushed against the river bottom at the opposite shore, Isaac dropped his oar and collapsed. Ranger ran to Isaac's side and licked his cheek. His skin was salty and hot, too hot. Ranger nuzzled him to stand up. The other men were already marching up the bank. Isaac tried to stand, but his knees buckled under him. His back felt as if it might split in two. His head pulsed with a sharp, throbbing pain that made everything blurry. He felt the dog's rough tongue on his cheek. Then everything went black. Chapter 3 Comprehension Questions. Question 1. Who is Joe and why is he part of the group ferrying George Washington's Continental Army off Long Island to the Brooklyn side of the East River? Sample answer. Joe is Isaac's friend. Joe is a black man enslaved by a merchant in Marblehead, Massachusetts. This merchant was likely asked to serve in the 14th Continental Regiment, but sent Joe in his place. Question number 2. Why do you think Ranger has been transported to this period in our country's history? Sample answer. Ranger has been transported back to this period in our country's history because Isaac needs Ranger's support. Question number 3. How is Ranger helpful to Isaac? Sample answer. Ranger licked Isaac to let Isaac know he was there to help him. Later, when Isaac collapsed on the Manhattan shore after helping get the last American troops across the East River, Ranger licked Isaac's cheek and nuzzled him to stand up. But everything went blank for Isaac because he was sick and exhausted. And that takes us to chapter number 4.